And I now look to Ben Smith to close the case for the opposition.
Thank you, Chris. It's an honor to be here. I was told by our great British political editor in London, Jim Watterson, that he got his break here essentially as a student at Oxford waiting for someone to say something dumb and running out and calling the Nationals and selling them the story. I do not, and I think that hopefully when you have all tweeted the idiotic things that we say, and in that sense undermined maybe not such great journalism, but a sort of opportunity for Oxford students. I also wanted to recognize Jeanine Gibson, our British editor-in-chief here, who I think her previous was in this building years ago when she was dragged to pretend to be interested in Jeffrey Archer. I think I'd like to make, I hope that you listened to and were persuaded as I was by Mel and by Adam and the student speakers. And I found much of what the folks supporting the other side said persuasive, although I think that they tried at every point to get away from the actual proposition here and to tell you that social media undermines democracy, undermines society, that Facebook is a deeply problematic company. Those are all true stories. Those are stories you'll read in BuzzFeed. Those are stories that you'll see in Damien's tweets and in Stephen's tweets. Stephen's also a master of one particular social media practice. I hope you've read his farewell column to Britain, which was trolling in its highest form. I think I'd like to make two basic points. One is that I think the argument you're hearing from the other side rests on the notion that you have no memory of what the world was like before social media, that there was a halcyon golden age, and if only we could make journalism great again and go back to that era, that it would all be fine. I mean, I can't imagine Brits would believe that. I heard a lot of American accents. Maybe some of them will buy it, but I mean, you all know the hallowed history of British journalism. I have to bring a copy of the Daily Mail. The entire British internet rests essentially on debunking and making fun of half-truths and lies spread by tabloids. That seems like that's what British Twitter is basically for. But I think it's not just the sort of most egregious elements of 20th and 19th century journalism and early 20th century early 21st century journalism. Really, the last hurrah of pre-social media journalism was the advocacy for the Iraq War that you saw on the pages of the Times and a lot of the British press. Just when bloggers who nobody was quite listening to were sniping at the sides of it and raising questions. But there wasn't social media to really challenge it. But it's also true if you came up as I did in a normal newsroom. My first job was in the middle of the country covering cops. And if you were a police reporter here, in Oxford, in Indianapolis, wherever, and a crime story broke, you would immediately, everyone would race to try to cover it. You'd have the wrong name of the victim, and you'd go to the wrong house, and you'd knock on their door, and you'd have the wrong people, and you'd also have the wrong name of the assailant, and the police would be feeding you bad information because they were also confused. And through the course of it'd be a total disaster. And through the course of the day, and you'd have until 4 p.m. for the early deadline, midnight for the late one, you would sort it out. And what wound up in print would be something approximating the truth day to day on these sort of relatively straightforward stories. Now, of course, there's a terrorist attack or a plane crash or a murder, and you see all the reporters, you see us on Twitter scrambling around, chasing the wrong information, asking obnoxious questions of victims in public, doing all the things that we have always done, and you say, my God, these people are idiots. They don't know anything. I mean, the truth is that we were always idiots. It's just that you now see it. And I think there's a question that you should really ask yourselves, whether you prefer that kind of transparency or whether you would prefer the illusion that there was this perfect kind of high priesthood handing down truth. Maybe some people would, I wouldn't. And then I think on the other side of the coin, I think it's easy, it's not just transparency. Social media, again, as these speakers capably argued, has amplified propaganda, has undermined democratic institutions in real and troublesome ways. Those are real, and I think really aside from the question that's being debated here, whether this House believes that social media undermines good journalism. But I think one of the pillars that social media has brought is transparency. The other is something that's so core to how humans use social media that I think sometimes you don't see the connection to journalism. But one of the things that social media does across the board is it makes people feel less alone. I think you saw this in the It Gets Better videos. You see it every day. But I think you really saw it, as Stephen mentioned, in the really the reaction to the Harvey Weinstein story, which was an act of really great traditional journalism by his colleague Jodi Kantor and others, spending months and months and months gathering information. When that story broke, people shared their experiences in a way that I think is very hard to imagine before social media. And these floodgates opened on stories about Kevin Spacey at the Old Vic 20, 30 years ago. The story we broke about Kevin Spacey, again, years and years ago, as a young actor in New York, allegedly assaulting a 14-year-old boy. These stories have been there all along. Like, they aren't new stories. What was new was that there was a place to tell them, a platform to tell them on. And so I think that if you are working in a newsroom right now, it's very hard to argue that social media has undermined the journalism that we are trying to do. That's why you heard from Adam, and I think in certain ways from Stephen, that it actually is a huge gift to a lot of the best journalism that we do. Finally, I would say that I think there's something a little patronizing to a younger audience to say that if only you can hark back to this golden age. You heard some sort of unsourced science from the other side that your attention spans are only 8 seconds. Does anyone think that? In fact, if you look at the sorts of that long form is going away, that people have certain kinds of psychological instincts, and I think if you look at, for instance, a great publication like The Atlantic, you'll see a huge boom in great long-form journalism. Certain kinds of lazy, mediocre long-form journalism are less read, but I think that's all right. And I think that you don't even have to look to the past. You can really just go to any newsstand out here and see some examples of really awful traditional journalism that is contained at this point only by people's sense of shame on Twitter and how they'll be treated when they spread lies in the old media of print. So I hope you'll vote to reject the motion, and thank you for your time.